Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ariel Sharon has died and been given a state funeral. He is called controversial and even a peacemaker by mainstream media and political classes. Many others strongly reject these descriptions. For much of the world, particularly the Palestinians, Sharon's legacy is much more about hate, violence, intolerance, and death. On this edition of CrossTalk, we ask a simple question: who was Ariel Sharon? To CrossTalk the life and times of Ariel Sharon, I'm joined by my guest, Joshua Landis in Norman. He is the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In Washington, we have Yousef Munayyer. He is the executive director of the Palestine Center. And in Tel Aviv, we cross to Amir Oren. He is the defense and government writer for Haaretz Daily. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I want fair time for all three of my guests here. Joshua, if I can go to you first in Norman. Vice President Joe Biden said at the funeral about Sharon that he was a complex man who engendered strong opinions. I suppose I could say that about you. I could say that about myself. How does it apply to Mr. Sharon, considering his history and his life?
Well, we have two very different narratives about Sharon. For Israelis, he was the lion of Israel. He was a defender, the bulldozer. People loved his ferocity, his ability to kill Arabs and to conquer the land of Israel. He believed that Israelis should settle it all. From a U.S. perspective, we have the same debate here with the Indian warriors, the white European settlers who killed American Indians and settled the West. General Custer, President Andrew Jackson, who killed many Indians, conquered big hunks of the United States, and they are heroes to American historiography, but to American Indians and indigenous people, they are, of course, villains who massacred harmless people. In Russia, you could take somebody like Catherine the Great, who grabbed a big hunk of Poland, of course, the Crimea and all the areas north of the Black Sea. But of course, Catherine was very different because she made love in many ways to her people before she went to war against them. In Poland, her first great love was the King of Poland, and that, of course, eased the conquest of Poland. So she made love and she made war, whereas I suppose Prime Minister Sharon was really the warrior. He made war and he didn't make so much love.
All right, Yousef, if I can go to you in Washington. In Western media, he's been called a peacemaker. How can you possibly apply that to the late Mr. Sharon? Go ahead.
Sure. I think Joshua's kind of description of likening the differing narratives to, those 19th century examples are interesting and effective. But the difference is, of course, in modern times, we have a far more defined and commonly accepted understanding of what is legal and illegal during war times than we did in those days. And any objective observer looking at what Ariel Sharon did through his lifetime, both on the battlefield and in positions of power in the civilian political establishment, can see that more often than not, when given the opportunity, he violated the laws of war and committed some heinous crimes, either directly or indirectly. And of course, the victims in most cases were Palestinians. And so I think that, certainly the, history is written by the victors and perspectives differ based on what side that you're on. But we can look at things a little bit more objectively in a time and place where the laws of war are better understood, and we can all accept that the massacre of civilians is unacceptable regardless to what your nationality is or what the nationality of the victims are. And perpetrators of such crimes are stained with that reality for the rest of history, and their legacy must reflect that regardless to how successful they were on the battlefield otherwise.
Amir, would you like to reflect upon what we've heard from our two guests so far on the program? Go ahead.
Sure. What Joshua said about the various narratives is partly correct. And the stereotype of Israelis who applauded Sharon as the Lion of Judah and as the victorious general are not too accurate. Some Israelis did, some others objected to his behavior on the battlefield as well as off. The comparison to George Armstrong Custer is indeed right. It has been mentioned in Israel too, not the Andrew Jackson and other parallels, but Custer, yes, because he was reckless and because once too many, he got his entire command annihilated by the adversaries. And this was the main criticism lobbed at Sharon internally, regardless of what happened between Israel and the neighboring Arab states and between Israel and the Palestinians, which is a point we can come back to, within Israel, and especially by his own superiors, his colleagues on the general staff, and his subordinates. He was criticized for escalating small raids for no real purpose except his own quest for glory and for causing casualties on both sides. The vaunted Israeli paratroopers, which he led in the 50s, were killed almost the same way the Palestinians and Egyptians and Jordanians were. We can go to the other domain of Israelis versus Arabs if you want to now or a bit later in the program.
Okay. Joshua, did Sharon leave? We know that he was in a coma for the last 8 years of his life, but did he leave Israel a safer place? Because this is what Western media says, that he was a man of security. You know, he protected Israel. But did he, in the end, because of his inability or lack of vision to settle with the Palestinians, he did everything in his power to make sure there would never be a Palestinian state. Did he make Israel safer?
You know, that is very hard to know. Everybody points to the end of his life and says,
what if? Yeah.
He changed. In some ways, because he was accused of human rights violations in '82 in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, that he began to realize that he could not just destroy the Palestinians, and hence he withdrew from Gaza. That's a very complicated picture, because the Likud party, their conservatives in Israel, had for decades said we've got to get rid of Gaza. Gaza is 25 miles by 5 miles. It's densely populated, over 1 million people. It's a loser. We can get rid of tons of Palestinians by giving it independence, if you will, and withdrawing from Gaza. And that will solve the ticking time bomb, the demographic time bomb for the West. But he gave away Gaza in many ways in order to keep the West Bank. Yeah. And Israel has kept the West Bank today. The question is, will that blow up in Israeli hands? He achieved the conquest of the West Bank, the settlement of the West Bank. Will that blow up in Israel's hands in the future and cause real distress to Israel? Many people think it will. Many other Israelis think it's just fine and that they will solve that problem somewhere down the road. We really don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, Yousef, it seems to me, and you're all experts here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but looking at the entire career of Ariel Sharon, I don't think he changed his mind on anything. At all. I mean, he's the father of the settlements. I mean, the biggest problem in resolving this issue right now is the settlements. He's the father of the settlements, okay? I don't see any change, and I agree with what we just heard about Gaza. It was just a pain in the ass. Get rid of it, okay? It didn't serve his interests, all right? Go ahead, please.
Right. Well, look, you have to look at the man's career in its totality. If you focus on, one brief episode where his intentions could be debated at the very end of his life to try to characterize the entirety of it, I think, we're not being fair or objective in analyzing his legacy. The point I want to make, though, is that, John Kerry said in his comments on the passing of Ariel Sharon something that I thought was very accurate. He said that Ariel Sharon's journey was Israel's journey. And in reality, one cannot divorce the actions of Ariel Sharon from the state which tolerated him with a culture of impunity episode after episode. As early as 1953, he was involved in leading commandos at the village of Kibbia, demolishing homes of Palestinians while they were still inside, 70 Palestinians were killed, most of them women and children, all civilians. And this massacre brought great disgrace upon the state. And again, instead of being removed then from command and public life, he was allowed to continue in the 1970s in the Gaza Strip, where he became most intimately familiar with Gaza. He was the leader of the Southern Command of the Israeli military, and he, in an attempt to subdue Palestinian resistance in the refugee camps, demolished thousands of houses, displaced thousands of people, and was ultimately relieved of his command, the Southern Command in the Israeli military, only to find his way back into the system. So the Israeli state, which tolerated Ariel Sharon over time, is as much responsible through this culture of impunity for the war crimes he was allowed to carry out, precisely because they kept letting him back into positions of power. And of course, we know what happened in Sabra and Shatila in 1982, and we know what happened after he was recommended by an Israeli commission never to hold a ministerial position again. He became Prime Minister of Israel in 2000, and of course presided over the single largest period of expansion and settler population in the West Bank since the Menachem Begin era. So if we look at this man's reputation in its entirety, we can only come away with one conclusion. He believed in the use of force and the colonization of Palestinian territory, and more often than not, he succeeded in large part because a state enabled him and allowed him to do so.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ariel Sharon. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the life and times of Ariel Sharon. Okay, Amir, I'd like to go back to you in Tel Aviv. In your opinion, how did Sharon change Israel and change the Middle East? Because if we look at his life, he was involved in the 48 war. He spanned the entire history of the Israeli state up until the time of his illness and then death here. How did he change Israel, and how did he change the Middle East?
Well, time will not allow us to go into detail in looking into the entire history of the State of Israel, or even before the state was created. But one has to remember that up until the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel felt that it was the victim in the conflict, that it was the David, and the entire Arab world, including the Palestinians, were the Goliath. Now, the tables were turned after 67, and especially after the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, because compared to Israel, the Palestinians look like the victims. But we cannot judge 1953 through the prism of 1973 or 2013. And again, until 1977, Ariel Sharon was only a military officer. He became a politician in 1973, but only held positions of power in government since Begin came to power in 1977. As a military officer, he was not beloved universally. Some people admired him, others resented him, but in any event, he was an executive agent of the government. He did not shape policy, and if you ask whether he changed or whether he changed Israel,
Amir, I think even you would agree, Amir. I mean, he made a personal decision to invade Lebanon, and he lied about it to his own government here. I mean, was quote unquote proactive at times, and we all know what happened to Israel and the Lebanese people during that conflict. Go ahead.
Well, Peter, let me amplify on that. It is more complicated than lied to his government. Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon, and the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Raphael Eitan, all had a plan in the back of their minds, which they tried to hide from other ministers and from other military commanders, because they wanted to see whether the first stage of the invasion goes on as planned, whether the Reagan administration looks at it favorably or not. And they planned, if all went well, to go in. But let me go back to General Sharon in the early 70s, when he came out for a Palestinian state. Of course, there was a caveat. He wanted the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to become the Palestinian state on the east bank of the Jordan River rather than on the west bank. What he tried to do in Lebanon, and there he was, of course, short-sighted strategically, was change the Middle East, try to run the Palestinians out of Lebanon back into Jordan, where they will topple King Hussein, and then Israel can create a pact with the Palestinian state of Jordan. It was short-sighted for many reasons. Of course, the Lebanese Maronites were not able to hold power when the Syrians were against it, but also because the Iran-Iraq war and the Iranian Revolution made Hezbollah the emerging power in Lebanon.
All right.
Many variables.
Amir, a lot said there. A lot said there. Joshua, if I can go to you, we had a short history lesson there, but it seems to me that, you know, when you look at Lebanon, a failure. It created Hezbollah. We go look at Gaza, and then you have Hamas. You have the radicalization of the Shia in Lebanon. You bring in Iran into the equation. This is all the work, the handiwork of Mr. Sharon.
Well, I think one of the real turning points was the massacre at Qibya that we heard about in 1953. And Sharon had been given orders to create as much destruction as he could by Ben-Gurion. He went and he exceeded anybody's expectations. The Americans condemned this act. There were 70, largely women and children killed. They condemned the act and said the person who perpetrated this should be punished and so forth. There was a tense moment. And Ben-Gurion, there's a famous film clip of Ben-Gurion going up to Sharon, pinching his cheek and saying he's a good boy. And that encapsulates, I think, Sharon established this policy of smashing the Palestinians and the Arabs and hitting them 10 times harder than they could hit Israel, believing that in the end, this would change the attitude of the Arab world towards Israel, and they would leave it alone. Now, we don't know whether this policy has been a success for Israel. Certainly, Israel has settled the West Bank. This was a vision of Sharon's. They are secure today. Will it blow up in their hands in the future? We just don't know. The Americans ultimately gave Israel a pass, and we saw the New York Times obituary was very favorable with Sharon. And by and large, the American coverage of Sharon has been to lionize him. So you could say today that he got away with it, that he has established a greater Israel. Will history prove that that is a success? We were reading books about the great startup nation. Israel's got an economy that's bigger than all the Arab economies around it. It's got more. It has been an extraordinary success story in many ways. Will that explode? Will the Arabs? Will it be a Salah ad-Din story where eventually they'll come back and push the Crusaders out of Israel? We don't know.
Yousef, would you like to reflect upon that? Because I agree with everything we just heard from Joshua, but can this vision be maintained? Because it looks like they're at a dead end here with the so-called peace process, which of course Sharon was against from the very, very beginning, against the treaty with Egypt, against relations with Jordan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So his vision has been fulfilled, but will it live on?
Sure. I just wanted to respond first to a couple things that were said earlier in the history lesson that we were treated to. I understand that the Israeli perception might be that they were underdogs prior to 1967, but the objective reality, historically speaking, in terms of the battlefield, and we know this because David Ben-Gurion tells us so in his diary, is that every stage of the war in 1948, the Israeli troops outnumbered the combined forces of the Arab armies, which were under disarray, various commands, and far less armed and much more poorly trained. And of course, the outcome reflected that reality, and the outcome was the mass depopulation of Palestine and the Israeli conquering of the vast majority of Palestine as well. So I'd object to the characterization of Israel as an underdog, even from that stage. And in Lebanon, of course, you know, like as it was mentioned, Sharon wanted to try to shape the reality in Lebanon by installing a government there. And while the Syrians and the Iranians may have all had their desires, you know, the key factor there is that Lebanon is an intensely complicated place when it comes to its domestic politics, and that had as much to do with the outcome there as anything else, as much as outside intervention. But at the end of the day, even among Israelis on the right, when it comes to the West Bank and the settlement enterprise, you know, Sharon was on the extreme end. You look at some of the stances that he took and plans that he stood by in the 1970s. His vision for the West Bank was really the closest to Bantustanization at some of the earliest stages, more than anyone else, more than Drobel's, more than Yigal Allon, more than anyone else. He wanted to create small pockets of Palestinian presence in the West Bank that would be surrounded with Israeli settlements. And so that is his legacy today. And, you know, Israel's stuck with that reality today and is dealing with this question of essentially apartheid in the modern world because it has entrenched its presence among a Palestinian population and can't find its way out.
Amir, if I can go back to you in Tel Aviv, how much did Sharon change Israeli politics moving to the right? Did it reflect his beliefs, or did he push it that way? What is it, the egg or the chicken here when it comes to right-wing politics in Israel today?
I'm afraid we're giving him too much credit when we assign strategic visions and long-range planning to Sharon. He was hungry for power. He wanted to gain power by getting elected from the right and then governing from the center. And even when he was in government, he tried to get as much power within the cabinet. So, for instance, when Menachem Begin formed his first government and gave Moshe Dayan the foreign ministry and Ezer Weizmann the defense portfolio, much to Sharon's chagrin, Sharon, as a minister for agriculture, made problems for Begin, Dayan, Weizmann, and Jimmy Carter by leading the settlement activity. But as defense minister in Begin's second government, on the eve of the war in Lebanon, he dismantled the settlements in Yamit, in the Rafah salient, which was part of the price of the agreement he tried to sabotage first. And what he took from this experience of being ousted by the Begin government following the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry was that he should never take an agreement with number 2 in the U.S. administration.
Amir, let me jump in here. We're almost out of time. Joshua, I'd like to give you the last word. 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, the legacy of Sharon's legacy is that he wanted to settle the West Bank, and he wanted to destroy any possibility of a two-state solution. And in many ways, it looks like he has succeeded in doing that today. Will that destruction of the two-state solution blow up and create an apartheid that is insoluble, or will it not? And that is the real big question mark hanging over Israel today. And we don't know the answer to it yet, although the situation is very difficult.
All right. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests today in Norman, Washington, and in Tel Aviv. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
Please,